Do you have Luigi Mangione on too today? I heard that you were going to have him on as well. Wait one sec. Are we matching? What are you wearing?
Like a kind
Mine's
of
more orange.
orangey
Yours is
red as
more
well.
red. Yeah, that's true. All
Mine
right,
a
one
little more
sec.
orangey and red life, but I'm gonna call this a win for us. Can you imagine it'd be the get of the century? I mean, what do you make of how we're getting all of these photos of him in his jail cell and stuff? Is that normal? It feels abnormal
To what? To put him
that we're getting
taking
photos of
pictures of
him in
him?
his, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess people know those generate clicks, and even law enforcement agencies are living in the internet age. I don't know. It is,
But
in Brazil, they do this all the time. Like if somebody powerful goes to prison, they'll very sadistically describe like every part of their day, like how shitty their food is, how, especially if like people are rich and powerful, and then suddenly in prison, it
yeah,
becomes this form of sadism. I think it might be a little bit of that. Like, look, we
yeah,
caught this
but
caged animal.
is it not clearly backfiring? I mean, they can't get a bad picture of this guy.
I mean, every picture they take is one is better than the next. Like, I don't know if you saw the most recent,
No,
the
what's the
most
most recent
recent.
one?
There's a new recent mugshot, and it's spectacular. He must have got a really good night's sleep.
The mugshot, the like slightly
There was
tilted
one
his.
yesterday, and it was kind of tilted, but then there was like a real classic one today where he was already like in the orange, and that color works
Oh
very well on
boy.
him. And hey, wait, hold on one second. I just gotta make sure that this is. I told you not to get me to talk about this, otherwise
I'm a
I'm
hundred
gonna go
percent
on and
gonna get you to
on.
talk about this. I 100% want to use this, Glenn. Are you kidding me? Like this is what the people want to know.
This is the kind of thing everybody's talking about. All right, all right, I just wanted to make sure that works. So I'm going to start the audio recording now if you're fine with that. But we don't have to
Yeah,
begin necessarily right
absolutely.
this second. But
I've been recording. I've been recording. Are you kidding? This is
oh, so you
gold.
have my Luigi drooling, my Luigi thirst already.
Glenn, you can't seriously be not wanting to talk about Luigi.
I'm willing to talk about anything, including maybe even especially Luigi. So as you know, I'm a very open-minded guest, very accommodating. So whatever you want to talk about, including that, I've been talking about it so much, so it's not like it's hard for me.
Well, what aspect of it are you? I mean, are you just talking about the thirst aspect of it, or kind of
No,
substantively?
no, no.
Because
I'm talking about the more substantive part as well.
like
I do
it's
actually.
so. I think one big question is: do you think he's actually the culprit?
Do I think what?
Do you think he's the culprit? Do you think he's actually the guy? Because there's some people who believe he's a patsy, and I think, and specifically, they are skeptical because they're skeptical of the idea that he would have been ID'd off of these partial face photos that sort of looked different from each other so many states away. It feels a little too
We're
convenient that
gonna
he
we're
would
gonna
have.
find out. We're gonna find out soon enough, right? We're gonna know presumably if he pleads guilty, if he contests that he was the person who did it. Um, I think a lot of people also are expressing skepticism and surprise that he would actually just be walking around carrying the weapon, the manifesto. That's basically a confession. And I understand that skepticism. I think it's appropriate. I don't think we ought to assume that the police found the person who did it. On the other hand, what I guess a word of caution, I would note that if you're actually somebody who gets to the point where you're willing to walk up to a CEO of a major company in the middle of Manhattan and point a gun at his head and pull the trigger multiple times until he's dead, you're operating in a mental framework that is not the same as ordinary people, because most people would have a lot of barriers to do that and would have to really change the way they think. So we don't know what his mindset is. Did he want to get caught? Is he actually as sort of agile and well planned as the NYPD was claiming? Is he really just a kid who got over and over his head and kind of got lucky to get out of New York City? I understand the skepticism, and I'm fine with sharing it. I don't think we need to jump to the conclusion that they got him, but I also could easily see those answers to those questions that a lot of people are asking.
I mean, when you look at I get not wanting to speculate, but before we get into a conversation where I think we're both going to sort of like talk as though we presume that he is the perpetrator, um, to like just give air to the kind of evidence that he might not be. And I think, there are different manifestos that are floating around the internet. I saw that Clint Klippenstein had declined to post about one of them because he felt like it was kind of an obvious fake because there were discrepancies between sort of the writing style and the quality of the writing in the printed, the one that's been circulating online, and some of his other writing that you can see in his kind of like book reviews on Goodreads and in a paper that he had written as a 15-year-old that he had posted to Twitter. And I think all of that seems sounding good. Also, the police say it was a handwritten manifesto and this was a typed up manifesto. But I just wanted to air out what your feelings were kind of fundamentally about the idea that this could be a sort of a distraction or an op.
I mean, like I said, first of all, one of the reasons why I'm hesitant to speculate one way or the other, and I absolutely think it's important to air that skepticism because it's just in general bad practice. I've noticed a lot lately that the minute the police or prosecutors, the Justice Department or the FBI or whomever makes a claim, like in an indictment or in a press conference, a lot of people just start treating it as gospel. And I really want to encourage people to get away from that as much as possible. So just in any case where we're saying just because the police have said they found somebody guilty does not in fact mean they're guilty. But he's going to have a lawyer very shortly. I presume it'll be a private lawyer provided by his family. That lawyer, in a very short period of time, once he's arraigned and indicted, is going to have to say whether they plead guilty or not guilty. If they're contesting that he was actually in New York, we're going to find all of that out. And if he comes out and says, yes, I did do it, as the way some people who commit crimes want to do because they're doing it for a specific reason, they don't want to deny that it was them, we'll know soon enough. So, the idea that the police just arbitrarily framed an innocent person who has nothing to do with the actual killer, that seems unlikely to me, but it's certainly not impossible. And I take your and everybody else's skepticism, as valid.
Yeah. I mean, so I should say, obviously, we're talking to Glenn Greenwald, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, host of System Update, fan favorite of the show, and I think of many in this political space. I wanted to ask you, I think, because you do occupy, I think, this really interesting place on the political spectrum where you have really earned, I think, the trust of people who both are sort of right identifying and left identifying because of your really consistent and principled stands on issues like, free speech, for instance. What you're making of how both the liberal and conservative media are framing the public outrage or the public, frankly, support for the shooting. I want to start by, I think, playing a clip from Bill Burr's podcast, which I think tees up the issue pretty nicely.
You know what's annoying me about this kid who killed this CEO is none of these news programs are talking about the incredible lack of empathy from the general public about this because of how these insurance companies treat people when they're at their most vulnerable, after we've all given them our money every fucking month, and now we finally need you, and all you do is deny us. And then these pussies and all of these things are taking the pictures of their CEOs off their websites. I got to be honest with you, okay? I love that fucking CEOs are fucking afraid right now. You should be. By and large, you're all a bunch of selfish, greedy fucking pieces of shit, and a lot of you are mass murderers. You just don't pull the trigger. That's why it looks clean. That's why these people look, oh my God, he was just, walking into a hotel. It's like, okay, but what was his job? What did he do? What was the results of it?
All right, that was comedian Bill Burr. What's your take, Glenn?
It reminds me a lot of the pre-election discourse that a lot of people in corporate media were having, where they were so completely disconnected from the priorities and the experiences of most people, including those on whose behalf they purport to speak. You get these like heads of gay groups or Black groups, from immigrant groups or Latino groups, and they're saying things that, as it turns out, huge numbers of people in those groups on whose behalf they purport to speak don't remotely believe. It's just not in their anywhere near their priority scheme, and that's why we got the election that we got, and why we get this kind of constantly detached elite discourse on the one hand from what everybody else is thinking and feeling that we've seen for a long time, that I think is extremely unhealthy for a society. So I think Bill Burr is exactly right that, I don't know if you heard, but like I told my own story when my husband was in the hospital. We had paid this insurance company for 20 straight years, every single month, huge premiums. As it turns out, they were owned by United Healthcare until 8 months ago. They paid everything because we were young and healthy. Everything was cheap. They were profiting us greatly. Then the minute David goes into the hospital and they realize it's serious, they concoct some bullshit reason why they're not responsible for paying and why they have to deny coverage. And we're in litigation with them. It just, I'm in a fortunate position where I'm not facing medical bankruptcy, but I could if I actually had to pay these costs. And so the rage that you feel, and I don't want to sound like a saint, but I've often thought about like other families that go through something like that, as horrific as it is, no matter who you are. And then on top of that, to have this insurance company screwing you and threatening you basically with permanent financial bankruptcy, the erasure of your financial security, because at the moment that you need them, this goes on and on and on. And so I absolutely have empathy for the emotions that were generated. And I think a lot of people are trying on purpose to conflate these two questions. Like, number one, do you encourage people to just go randomly murder health insurance executives? Or number two, if one is murdered, not because you've done anything about it, do you think it's valid for people to react based on their hatred of that industry? Why should I have to cry over this person? I didn't know this person. No one knew him. I have no idea what he was like. It doesn't really matter. His family can mourn him. I think the important thing is, why would somebody get motivated who had everything in his life going for him to commit and act like this? And why are so many people not expressing empathy for the person who was shot, but instead enraged at the industry that he represented? And I think what Bill Burr said there is crucial. You go throughout history, one of the most dangerous things is if elites no longer fear the majority of the population. That brings revolution, it brings instability. And I've wondered for a long time now, at least since the financial crisis, but even before that, why are our billionaires and our extremely rich oligarchs so indifferent to the anger that obviously they're generating among the great majority of people? Rockefeller and Ford used to ride down the street and throw dollars at people to improve their PR. They cared about, appeasing public rage at their wealth and power. The current oligarch class seems indifferent to that. Their choice seems to be, let's just build up a surveillance state and a militarized state and crush them if they try and do anything. And I think a lot of that is what you're seeing here, this idea that nobody wants to talk about that. And this is a really good window into it.
I'm so sorry. I hadn't heard that you had struggled on top of everything else with David, pushback from the insurance industry. I know I shouldn't be surprised, but it is never not incredibly depressing to hear that. And the fact that even people of relative affluence find themselves in the hardest moments of their life having to have those kinds of conversations and to have their attentions divided in that way is cruel beyond belief. I'm interested in this question of why the very wealthy, why elites don't feel the fear that kind of early 20th century robber baron types felt to try to appease the public. You see a kind of indifference. You see, right now, so many people sort of in Trump's orbit openly talking about using Doge to cut Social Security. You see, both Fox and MSNBC news hosts sort of manufacturing the consent for the idea that you need to prioritize the empathy for Brian Thompson's family as opposed to the people who suffered at the hands of his entire industry.
There are a lot of people who are happy about this. Yes, hiding in the nice anonymous dumpster fire that is Twitter. But show these tweets celebrating his death. Even people who call themselves journalists, Ken Klippenstein and Taylor Lorenz, tweeting about how bad a man he was the day he died. People had similar tweets wishing Trump had been killed as well. All right, well, I guess that's par for the course these days. But don't these people understand? Won't someone in their life, if these are their real names, explain to them? You are worse than what you oppose when you celebrate murder as a justifiable end for disagreement over policy. I mean, what the hell is going wrong here? Really crazy stuff. And the people whose names are actually theirs, if you follow them and don't light them up, you're not doing your job as a citizen. Well, is this the fruit of the poisonous tree of all this talk about anti-establishment and anti-corporations? Maybe.
And in particular, it feels serendipitous is probably not the right word, but really interesting lesson in contrast to see how the verdict in the Jordan Neely case with Daniel Penney being held not responsible, being vindicated in murdering him on the subway and killing him in this kind of a proto self-defense. People are going to debate that characterization of it. And the reaction to Brian Thompson's killing. In particular, there was a clip from Fox News that I wanted to get you to react to.
We'll dig into it later. The Instagram posts from nutbag people, which I was sent in the commercial break earlier, crazy. Like, he's cute, and people celebrating this. This is a sickness. Honestly, it's so disappointing, but I guess we shouldn't be surprised. Gentlemen, thank you so much. And up next, the other big news out of New York, Daniel Penney. A lot of people think he's a hero, and tonight he's not guilty. My take next.
I mean, what do you do with that, Glenn?
All right, so this is the thing that really drives me insane. So the condemnation of the left, where I think most of the sentiment emerged from, that what this killer did was at least understandable, if not commendable. The whole basis of the condemnation, how dare you celebrate this person's death or express some degree of happiness, anything other than disgust and rage that the fact that he was murdered, is based on this principle that they're claiming that it's always wrong to celebrate the death of a human being unless there's justice and due process administered, like a death penalty after a trial, or I guess maybe in like some war where the laws of war, but in general, it's wrong to celebrate someone's death. For every single person claiming this, I can name in 10 seconds 100 people whose deaths they would celebrate. Do you think, for example, if tomorrow Nicolas Maduro died, or Bashar al-Assad died, or Vladimir Putin died, or the Iranian mullahs died, or whomever, that Laura Ingraham and her guests would not be instantly saying how great this was, how, if anybody was expressing sadness over it, they would instantly condemn those people for expressing sadness at the death. We all have people who maybe we don't want to go ourselves and kill, or maybe we do want to, but just can't get ourselves to, but whose deaths we sort of say, this was well deserved, maybe the world is better off without them. It's just such hypocrisy. And I can't stand when people don't speak from reasoned principles, or they don't state their first principles and then see whether or not it's actually something they're willing consistently to apply. I remember that time when, I forget his name, but about 5 months ago, as an act of protest against U.S. support for the Israeli destruction of Gaza, someone incinerated himself in front of the White House as protest. And a lot of people cheered him and celebrated him. And people were saying, it's disgusting to celebrate this, encouraging people to incinerate themselves or commit suicide. And then you look, 10 years ago when the Arab Spring was happening, there were several different incinerations. There have been some in China with Tibetans and other. And of course, they're constantly celebrated by the same people saying it's disgusting to celebrate it. So, we can delve into the whole Neely case and how it relates to this case and other cases as well. But of course, there is this sort of, I think we have to separate this analysis of this person as a private person, as a father or husband or whatever. Like I said, that's for their family, and what they represent politically. Why are we talking about this person? How do we know this person? Why is their murder getting so much attention and other people's aren't? And in that realm, as a kind of public figure representing certain ideas or certain ways of doing things or certain practices, of course, we're allowed to express happiness or sadness or some other emotion that's different than what we would express if we were visiting the family as part of the wake.
Yeah, I mean, of course. And look, I really appreciate your point about first principles, but I had two thoughts about that. One is that sometimes I think it's a little overstated. I think that sometimes your principle can be, it's good when good things like bad things happen to bad people, and it's bad when bad things happen to good people, and to just acknowledge that it's subjective and you're coming from an ideological place, and that you don't have some overarching theory like pacifism or being opposed to the death penalty or whatever, and that there's a time and a place for certain kind of things to advance your own ideological project, and just own it and be like, yeah, I'm going to be for my ideological team and not for yours. I think that's fine. Just admit it. But the hand wringing that says,
but that's the key, right? The admit it part. If you're going to adopt that view, which I think is completely valid, it's not a principle. It's just I'm happy when bad people die who do bad things to people, and I'm unhappy and sad when good people die. Then don't go around when other people are celebrating someone's death and say, "How dare you celebrate the death of a person?" Right? Then just say, "No, that person's death doesn't deserve to be celebrated because they're actually a good person." But don't pretend you object on principle.
Exactly. The other thought I had is that for as much flack, and you might disagree with me here, I'm interested to hear your thoughts, as much flack as the kind of like power analysis that the left has been making for years has gotten in recent years with all of the scrutiny about kind of, DEI and woke and all of that. To me, there is something consistent about saying, well, at the end of the day, Jordan Neely is a mentally ill person who's frequently unhoused, who had committed some acts of violence and menacing on the subway, but who never killed anybody. And that's something that you can't say about both Daniel Penney and, Brian, very, very, very arguably, I would argue, Brian Thompson, if not directly by pulling a trigger, but by being the head of a company who has a 32% denial rate that directly results in the death of so many thousands of Americans each year. And that there's, I think it makes me skeptical of some of the kind of conservative leaning attempts to undermine the idea that power analysis is really critical to understanding the moral stakes of these kinds of controversies.
Yeah, I think we have to talk about the specifics of it rather than these concepts that are running around it, because otherwise we risk losing the analysis that's actually connected to those two incidents if you're trying to compare these two. So first of all, just legally, there's an obvious difference, which is that what Brian Johnson was doing as the CEO of United Health, as despicable and immoral as it was, is legally sanctioned. It's not illegal. It's not a crime to do that. We've made it legal for health insurance companies to be privatized and to bilk people and exploit them at their worst time of need purely for profit, even if it means destroying them at their time of greatest vulnerability. Whereas going onto a subway and menacing people and basically saying, I'm about to do things I'm going to go to jail for life, putting people in real fear, imminent fear of their body because they're trapped in a subway with a person who clearly seems to be unhinged. That's not legal. If they had just detained him and not killed him, he could have easily have been arrested and gone to prison. So I do think there's that difference. But on moral grounds, I think that you can make the case that what the CEO of United Health is doing is more harmful, more fatal, more deadly, and therefore more deserving of a violent response to stop it than what was done on the subway by the homeless person who got on and started menacing people. But
it isn't. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, but I think it's very hard to make the case that one is clearly morally justified and the other isn't. And I think that's what most people think.
I think that the problem is that our legal system routinely, I would argue its objective is to make legal immoral things that are done by certain parties who write the laws and to criminalize certain actions that are unfavorable to the group that writes the laws. And the group that writes the laws are the affluent. So one of the examples that I love when people bring up is the idea that sure, it's a class neutral rule. It's an ostensibly neutral rule that nobody is allowed to sleep under the bridge, but the only people who are asking to sleep under the bridge or have the need to sleep under the bridge are the people who can't afford alternative housing. And so you have laws that frequently and disproportionately criminalize the behaviors that are associated with the poor. And similarly, of course, our legal system hasn't criminalized mass murder by spreadsheet because they're writing all the spreadsheets. And of course, it would also not criminalize, as we just discovered with the verdict in the Jordan Neely case, that it also doesn't criminalize a kind of vigilante murder when it is done by someone who is relatively more affluent, ostensibly in the interest of protecting other relatively moneyed subway riders against somebody who has been sporadically unhoused and mentally ill and all these other kinds of things. And I think that's no accident. And so the reaction isn't, I think you're obviously technically right about what is and what isn't legal. But as we're seeing standards being set and, precedent being set, it's being set in a way that protects the interests of the relatively affluent in all of these situations. And I think that's what people are responding to. Not the what is the law, what does the law allow, but why is it that the law allows these things? And when I think about the power dynamic that I was referencing before and that kind of power analysis that the left frequently articulates, I'm thinking back to either it was tort law or criminal law, I can't remember which I had the same professor for, but my favorite law professor who I talk about a lot on this podcast, John Hanson, and who has been a guest on this podcast, and I encourage people to go back and listen to that episode if they haven't already. I remember vividly in his class, him presenting us with some, it must have been torts, some routinely taught tort cases, and asking us to interrogate whether or not we think the outcome was in fact just by saying, well, who do you think had the most ability to control the outcome in this particular case? Like, who had the most ability to prevent the harm from actually befalling the subject of the case? I think we were talking about, do you remember the one? Sorry to do this. I know you hate being reminded of being a lawyer, as do I.
I do. I get traumatized with talk of law school.
But there was one about a little Irish girl immigrating on a boat. Maybe she wasn't Irish, but some European girl immigrating on a boat to America. And when she got there, there were signs posted saying you have to get vaccinated, but she couldn't read because she's poor and maybe didn't speak English. And she was without her parents, and a guy with a lab coat, an adult, comes and she gets the injection. She has a bad reaction to it. And there's a lawsuit. And the court decides, well, there were these warning signs that there could be potentially bad, adverse effects on the sign. That's on her. And I remember Professor Hanson asking us, well, does it make sense to ask someone in that child's situation to be the one who's responsible for anticipating the potential downstream effects when she's in such a constrained position of getting the shot or getting back on a 3-week journey across the country? That's sort of an analysis. If we actually want the harms not to befall the public, which party in a particular situation is best situated to prevent the harm from happening in the first place?
Well, I don't think we have any disagreement on how to understand the United Health shooting. I think there definitely is some I'm sensing when it comes to Daniel Penney and what happened there. So first of all, I guess what I would say is that in the situation as it happened, we don't know what would have happened had Daniel Penney not intervened. We don't know if Jordan Neely would have hurt somebody, if somebody would have felt threatened and been very scared, which can be, so, if you felt assaulted or threatened. And we don't know in a case where somebody is mentally unwell and kind of desperate and threatening people, what they're going to do. We don't have that counterfactual because, in fact, Daniel Neely didn't intervene. But what I would say is that when we want to come to a systemic analysis, of course, it's true, and it always has been true, and unfortunately in capitalism, it always will be true, that those who are richest and most powerful are able to write the laws in a way that benefits themselves. So the system will always benefit the interest of those with the most power over the lawmaking process, over the court process. I wrote a whole book on this in 2011 called With Liberty and Justice for Some, about this two-tier justice system that we inevitably will have, especially as income inequality grows further. In Manhattan, however, you had a case where I don't think anybody believes or has alleged that Daniel Penney went out that day trying to go murder somebody. What he did was react to what a lot of people on that train said was very threatening behavior that scared them. And he was trying to restrain the person because he felt like they might hurt him. Nobody knows what Jordan Neely's history is. They don't know if he's hurt people before. So in that situation, a lot of people are objectively scared, not just one person. And in a lot of jurisdictions, I might even say most, this would not have been prosecuted as a crime given the motives that were at play. But in Manhattan, where I think you have a much different set of political motives and political values and political priorities. You have a district attorney who was elected specifically to implement a certain worldview. Daniel Penney was prosecuted. He was prosecuted very aggressively. And under the law, if it were found by the jury that he actually acted with the kind of motive that the law requires if you're going to convict somebody, he would have been convicted. And by all accounts, there was a jury that was quite divided on the manslaughter charge. It's a very serious charge. And so I think it's very hard to say in this situation, even though a jury of a bunch of Manhattan liberals ended up acquitting him, that the system was somehow geared in his favor, because he ended up with a huge chunk of his life consumed by criminal charges that were going to be sent, that would send him to prison for a long time, that a lot of people, I would say arguably most people, do not think he should have been prosecuted for.
Well, good. Let's clarify some of the facts of this case. One, that Daniel Penney, for all of his erratic behavior, he reportedly threw trash around the train. People had got up.
You mean Jordan Neely? Jordan Neely.
Sorry, Jordan Neely. Sorry.
Yeah.
Jordan Neely had reportedly thrown trash around the plane and around the train. He removed his jacket and aggressively threw it to the floor. Passengers moved away from him. Witnesses said he did not assault anybody. And that Penney approached Neely from behind and put him in a chokehold after that erratic behavior. So again, the facts are that Neely did not, in fact, assault anybody. And as much as I don't want to minimize, look, I'm from New York. I'm not trying to minimize that sometimes you feel unsafe.
You mean physically assaulted? He didn't physically assault anybody.
Yeah, right. And so I don't want to minimize that you can feel unsafe on the train. I've been in situations in train cars like this where I've moved to the other end of the train or gotten off at the next stop and gotten to a different car. But that is not the same thing as saying that I think it's appropriate for someone vigilante justice style to then put the erratically behaving person into a chokehold, to maintain that chokehold through to the next train stop. Meanwhile, other passengers are saying, you're going to kill him, expressing concern for the health of this person who has now been completely restrained. And then reportedly, and this is now out of the realm of the fault of Penney per se, but to the first responders, apparently there was some delay in getting him aid, reportedly because of his smell. And I think these class factors of people not having the same concern for the sensitivity and the well-being and the life of people who look and act a certain way and are from a certain class status. And I'm curious, do you think that this is a neutral law being applied? Or do you think the outcome might have been different if a homeless person who may or may not be mentally ill and who may or may not smell bad and all of these other kinds of things, acting erratically, saw some frat bro menacing a young woman who was drunk or whatever coming from a party on a train, decided to restrain him and ended up killing someone who, was on scholarship to Duke or what have you?
Yeah, so I want to be careful because I don't want to be put into the position where I'm now the defense attorney for Daniel Neely, because I didn't really for Daniel Penney. I didn't follow the trial.
Sure.
Every day I wasn't there in the courtroom. I didn't hear the witnesses. So I'm basing it on, I paid some attention to it, but on what I know. So I just want to make sure that I'm not here to adamantly argue that he never should have been prosecuted or should have been exonerated, although I can make that case based on what I know. So I guess I just want to just ask you a couple questions, and I'm not trying to do this rhetorically, but really to understand what you're saying. So he didn't just go onto the train and kind of just be distracting or say loud things. He was specifically saying, I'm ready to go to prison for life. He was saying the sorts of things that any objective person would find quite threatening. And a lot of people on that train, including people of all races, said that they felt threatened. They felt scared that he was going to do something because of his behavior. And I also think we need to be very careful that we don't turn Daniel Neely into some sort of Daniel Penney, rather, the defendant, into some sort of wealthy Wall Street tycoon. He is from a working class background. He ended up going to the military because that was the way for him to create opportunity for himself. He doesn't seem to me to be a person of wealth, although I guess compared to somebody who doesn't have a home, pretty much anybody is. So in that situation, maybe, but I just think we need to be careful that we don't end up depicting him as sort of like the CEO of United Healthcare. If there, let's say there were a policeman on that car, you were on that car, other people on that car, he's screaming things like, I'm ready to go to prison, I don't care, I'm gonna, and people are really nervous because they can't defend themselves. And there's a policeman on that car. Would you approve of, or would you even expect a policeman to intervene and restrain him until the next subway stop because of that behavior?
Yes, I think that's a great question, a great point, precisely because regardless of whether police always follow their training, they do get training with millions and millions and millions of our tax dollars in New York, almost $6 billion of New York City's budget, to be able to restrain people in ways that aren't lethal, right? And to have the means and the tools to do so, and to be able to administer medical care and all of those other kinds of things, which is why this asymmetry in terms of how we're thinking about vigilante justice, I think, is really interesting.
But you're also somebody who believes the police often fail to adhere to those standards, that they often apply lethal force in ways that are completely inappropriate. The police officers who killed George Floyd were similarly trained on how to apply force and restraint without being lethal about it. And so a lot of times that's really not the answer. But okay, I get your point. It is true. Although Daniel Penney was trained in this as well. He learned this in the Marines. Where he wasn't just training how to kill people, but also how to restrain people. But let me ask you though. So if the police is there, if there's a police officer there on the train, you would both approve of and expect, in fact, the police officer to intervene and to constrain the person who's making everybody scared on the train. But so if there is no police officer there, and you have the same person being just as threatening, just as menacing, scaring people just as much, is the idea that everybody who's on that train should just do nothing, should just sort of let him do whatever he wants to do?
I think it's important to point out that Jordan Neely didn't actually make contact with anybody and hurt people, because while menacing, I think, actually is a crime in New York, it is not, the response to his menacing was not proportionate. And I think regardless if it was a police officer, and certainly if it's a kind of lay bystander, the force has to be proportionate. If Daniel Penney hadn't killed Jordan Neely, then I think this would be a hero story. He maybe prevented something much worse from happening, and no one got hurt, and Jordan Neely got the medical attention or whatever other social supports he needed, and okay, we're off to the races. But that's all not right. Let's
stop there. I just that's interesting. I want to hear your view on that. So let's say Daniel Neely had intervened in the way that he intervened. He successfully restrained,
or maybe not restrained. Maybe the intervention.
Well, no, but let's say physical restraint was necessary. Like he wasn't being susceptible to reason.
Well, why?
That happened. I'm sure you've seen that before, where you try and persuade someone who's in a kind of psychotic state, or someone who's in a very threatening state, and the more you try and reason with them, the more they react with hostility and aggression. All I'm saying is it's not clear that a non-physical. No, but Bree, if you get on a train and you start saying to people, I'm going to hurt you in a way that's going to send me to prison forever, that is an assault. It's not a physical assault, but you are assaulting people. You're not engaged in battery. You're not physically harming them, but you are threatening them. And that. But let me just ask you. I just want to ask you. So, because you started to say, if Daniel Neely had intervened, either let's say he intervened in a way that just talked the guy down, which obviously everyone would have been happy about. But let's say that was insufficient. He had to intervene, and the only way he could ensure the safety of himself and the people on the train was to physically restrain Jordan Neely. So he does it, but he does it in a way that's just maybe hurts his neck a little bit, but doesn't inflict any permanent damage, let alone death. They get to the next train stop. They call the police come and take him. Would you have regarded Daniel Penney's actions as justified or even heroic in that situation?
Yeah, we're both messing these names up. Daniel Penney.
I know they're so familiar that there's hard to say. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So a couple of things. We keep saying restraint, stop him. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but something on the lines of stopping him before X, stopping Neely before. And it presumes that there was going to be an escalation.
No, it
And I know
doesn't. No, it
sound-
doesn't. No, it doesn't.
minute,
If I get on the train, Jay, and say, I'm going to hurt all of you, I'm going to attack somebody.
Right.
I don't think
It
you have to
presumes
wait
I'm gonna
until
do
I
it.
do. Yeah.
Yeah, well, if I don't, but here's, and this is what the left gets in trouble for seeming too Pollyanna about this. And I'm not saying this from a Pollyanna place. I'm saying this I'm from New York, and I've been in this situation a million times.
Me too.
You don't get to the number of times I felt threatened. I think why so many New Yorkers are having a visceral reaction to this in defense of Jordan Neely is not because they like being menaced on the train, but because they have been in this exact situation 1,000 times, and never once has there actually been the escalation. Very rarely is there the escalation from verbal to physical. And second, even in the threat of an escalation, no one's ever killed somebody in cold blood in front of them as a consequence of being crazy on the train. And so that's the part of it that I'm really struggling with, the idea that you can kind of judge this guy and kill him for a pre-crime, for just saying, like, if I'm a crazy person walking down the street and I say, man, I'm really going to fuck some people up today, I'm going to do a mass murder today, that suddenly makes it okay for someone to shoot me in the head? Someone just to take my words at face value and murder me?
You're first of all, let's just be clear that, you're almost speaking as though you're speaking for people in New York. Like, the reason people in New York are so angry about this, a lot of people in New York are absolutely 100% on the side of Daniel Perry.
Well, sure,
They're quite angry that he was prosecuted. Well, precisely because they've been in that situation so many times, and you don't feel like you should have to feel like your physical safety is jeopardized by somebody who clearly is not in control of their faculties, who may not be mentally well. That is not an experience that I think people ought to be so dismissive of, because people have to use that stuff like every day to get to work. And the other thing I think we have to be careful about as well is you are speaking as though Daniel Perry did what he did with the intent to kill him. What he really wanted to do was murder him, like very similar to just taking out a gun and putting a bullet in his head, when I think the obvious intention was to restrain him, and maybe through a lot of factors, including the physical condition that he was in, which obviously was not quite healthy, it ended up killing him. And as you said, he didn't even kill him. He was still alive when he got to the train station.
Why does Daniel Penney's intent seem to matter more than the fact that sorry, I keep doing this with the names.
I know, it's terrible.
Jordan Neely didn't actually do anything. Why is Daniel Penney's state of mind more relevant than Jordan Neely's failure to actually lay a finger on a person? Like, this is the problem.
I'll give you an answer. Go ahead.
Conservatives have been really, I'm not putting you in the spots, but the kind of like, I shouldn't say conservative. I should say the more pro-Penney contingent has been kind of framing this as, why should someone have to be the victim of violence before someone intervenes? Like, it's natural that there should be an intervention. And I agree that there should be interventions. People should and did move to the other side of the train. Certainly there should be a more robust mental health infrastructure in all of the ways that we fail people in our society more generally. All of those other kinds of things. There's a healthcare story, since this is also ostensibly sort of where this conversation started with this healthcare CEO business story about Neely and being able to stay on his medications and all of those other kinds of things. But the way that we have decided to do law in this country is that you cannot hold people accountable. You can't pre-arrest people, and you certainly can't kill people for things that they might do. To me, this is getting into a real
I don't accept that premise. I don't accept that.
Okay.
No, I do not accept that premise. I don't think anybody is asserting that, left alone, that Jordan Neely would necessarily have gone and physically harmed anybody. I don't think that's the argument at all. I don't think that
then what's
requires
the basis of physical intervention?
I'll explain to you, because you yourself even said that had a police officer been on the train and the same exact thing that had happened, you would have supported. In fact, you would have expected the police officer to intervene. And
I said not necessarily physically, but let's
close that up. So let's say the police officer intervenes. He says, "Look, calm down," and the guy reacts, as often happens, in the opposite direction. He starts getting more threatening, more menacing, more aggressive, or he just kind of stays the same. He just sort of ignores it, and he's walking around saying, "I'm ready to go to prison for life. I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to, do something." And people are obviously scared. In that case, do you think the police officer should have the right to, should in fact physically restrain him, given how threatening he's being to the other passengers on the train?
I mean, I think it depends on the law. And like I said
No,
before,
more. I just mean morally.
recall-
We've got morally. Like, do you?
Look, morally, everybody deserves to feel. No, I don't even want to say that, because feelings of safety are very subjective. But I think morally, everybody deserves to be safe. I'll put it that way. And we live in a society, and I'm sorry, Glenn, we live in a society, and these interests have to be balanced. So again, the reason why I wanted to bring up this counterfactual where Jordan Neely doesn't die is because the balance of interest is now preserved. Nothing bad happened to Jordan Neely. The passengers don't feel like they are being menaced. It's a win-win. But the problem is we live in a world where the outcome here is not rare. As you pointed out with George Floyd and a million other cases, disproportionate responses to people who are perceived as violent or on the precipice of violent, particularly when they're poor, particularly when they're non-white, is a problem. It's a problem that led to the largest protest movement in American history, because it was so obvious to an entire country full of people, including folks that aren't especially sympathetic to criminal justice issues or race issues, that something went really, really awry if you're sitting there with your knee on somebody's neck for 8 minutes and you're just going to let them die. And similarly, Jordan Neely was in a chokehold for 5 or 6 minutes on the train, while other people around who were the menaced parties who wanted something to be done were expressing concern that, okay, maybe you're doing too much. And so the question isn't whether or not you have a right to intervene. It's whether or not you are able to intervene in a way that's proportionate to what Jordan Neely is actually doing. And it needs to be really clear that Jordan Neely didn't actually break the law by laying a finger on another person.
Yes, he did break the law. He did break the law. He just didn't physically accost anybody. He didn't physically harm anybody. But he absolutely, if you enter the train and say, I'm going to shoot everyone in this train, you are going to get arrested. And it's no defense to say, hey, I never shot anybody. I just said I was going to shoot people.
No. This is why I said that I believe that menacing is against the law in New York. Suggesting the presence of danger or threatening someone, wait, actually, that's just the regular definition, New York law. This is like the one thing I'm remembering from taking the New York bar right now. But whether, what the sort of, the problem is you don't get the death penalty for menacing. And this is why, one, it should be the cops and not a vigilante bystander, a lay bystander. And two, if you do intervene and you end up purposefully or not killing someone, you have to be accountable for it the same way that we would hope the police are held accountable for not fulfilling their responsibility to protect the public, but oftentimes inflicting harms upon the public.
But I don't know how you can say motive. I don't know how you can say motive doesn't matter. Okay, just two things about this. One is, I don't know how you can say motive doesn't matter when the entire criminal law is based on the motive. Everything is about motive. If I run somebody down on purpose with my car because I hate them and want them dead, that's going to be treated radically differently than if I'm speeding a little bit and someone juts out in front and I don't have time to stop them, and then the charges are going to be radically different because of my motive. So in this case, let's say that the police officer intervenes, as you're at least getting close to saying might be necessary, intervene in the sense of restraint if that's necessary. Let's say that when the officer applies the restraint that he should apply, that in those kind of circumstances he's trained to apply, because of Brandon Neely's health or because of drug use prior to getting on Jordan Neely, because of Jordan Neely's health or because he had used drugs or something, he ends up having a heart attack and dying because he's just so alarmed. His body reacts with a bunch of adrenaline, nothing that could be anticipated. The cop didn't want to kill him. He didn't try and kill him. He didn't even do anything wrong in terms of the application of restraint. Obviously, that's going to be treated vastly differently than if the cop just holds a restraint way beyond when they're supposed to, and it ends up killing him because the cop is basically indifferent to whether he lives or dies, which is essentially what happened in Milwaukee in Minnesota in Minneapolis with George Floyd. That's the first thing. The second thing is, of course, it would have been better if there was a cop there. Everybody agrees on that. The problem is, as is often the case, there was no cop there. And so if you're going to say that anytime a civilian intervenes to protect other people from someone who's clearly being threatened and menacing, that they have the responsibility to perfectly calibrate what their response is. Otherwise, they're going to go to prison if they are on the side of the excess force, even if they're afraid as well. They're the ones restraining the person. They know if the person gets away, they could be the person injured. I think what you're going to do is disincentivize everybody from ever getting involved, from anybody ever protecting anybody else. And you might say that's a good thing because you consider that vigilante justice. I think it's a terrible thing. Like, I don't want to see people who are being assaulted on the street and every civilian is afraid to intervene because if they intervene the wrong way, they're going to end up going to jail.
Right.
So they're like, yeah,
But
I
Glenn,
just rather.
he wasn't assaulting anybody.
He
I
was
think
free,
it's
just
really
not
telling.
physically. He was
No,
free.
it's-
He just wasn't. He wasn't physically assaulting people.
No,
and that's why you had so many people on the train saying they felt threatened.
Taking your jacket off. If there's more facts to this pattern, I'm not trying to obfuscate.
Right,
I'm just reading the fact
I'm in the
pattern.
position I didn't want to be in, where I'm now like the lawyer for Daniel Penney. So maybe there's like nuanced facts that I'm getting wrong. But I'm just saying.
But I'm just reading off the wiki. I'm being honest about that. I'm reading the fact pattern off the wiki because it seems relatively neutral as opposed to me going to like one liberal or one conservative website. But that could be wrong, but I'm just being open about what I'm doing. The fact pattern on Wikipedia was that he threw his jacket off on the ground and was throwing trash around the room and around the train.
What was he saying? What was he saying while he was doing that?
I will stipulate that it's what you have how you've characterized it. I'm gonna
like, I'm ready to go to jail forever. So he's throwing things, throwing his jacket on the ground, throwing things, and saying, I'm ready to go to jail forever.
Yes. But he
that's pretty threatening behavior. That's not the point.
That's
Glenn. True.
You don't get to put someone in a 5-minute chokehold before they've actually, acted.
How long can you put them in a chokehold? How long can you put them in a chokehold?
Well, if you take it upon yourself to do that and you cause death to that person, yes, you have to be held accountable because we do want to disincentivize people from taking a maximalist and unnecessary and disproportionate action in response to a threat that was not that did not require that to.
Do you know that's what Daniel Neely did? Did he actually choke as hard as he can in order to cut off his windpipe and prevent him from breathing? No, but that is because that's when we get to motive. Again, the motive, it could be.
Let's talk about motive.
Because it could be, Brie, that like a healthy person, somebody not like, malnourished, somebody not like on drugs, using drugs, somebody whose body was integrated. It could be that a normal, healthy person, an ordinary person, would not have died with that level of force applied to them. These are the sort of things that you really need to understand, having sat in the jury, listen to the testimony about the autopsy and everything else, to really speak confidently on. So, just because someone ends up dying doesn't mean it's the same as somebody deliberately trying to murder them.
So two things. One, we have in the law variations to accommodate for these issues of motive that still hold perpetrators of crimes accountable for even unintentional harms. And that's why we have murder and we have manslaughter and we have degrees of manslaughter for exactly this reason. Jordan, I agree that doesn't seem to be any evidence to suggest that Daniel Penney should have been charged with or convicted of murder. The question is whether or not he should be convicted of some degree of manslaughter, because he didn't intentionally perhaps kill Jordan Neely, but he did intentionally put him in a chokehold in the one anticipated consequence of exactly that kind of chokehold, because he had been trained, to your point, is in fact death. And the other point about the specific—
I don't think so. I don't think that's the kind of chokehold you use if you want to kill somebody. I mean, that's just not the kind of— if you're wanting to kill somebody, you take your arm and you apply maximum force to their windpipe so you prevent them from breathing, so they're dead. That's not what he did.
Okay.
And also, we had the best possible circumstances for you. We had a DA who very aggressively prosecuted this case, a judge who was extremely who was anti-defendant and pro-victim, and we had a jury filled with Manhattan liberals who were screened for that reason, who would absolutely have convicted him.
It's a mixed bag in Manhattan. You can't have it both ways. There were people who felt very strongly on both sides of this issue, as you pointed out.
No, I was saying citywide. Manhattan is the most left-wing or the most progressive part of New York.
Okay, Glenn, that feels very selective. And the idea that, of course, Jordan Neely that Daniel Penney didn't have an attorney who was also voir direing people and selecting the most advantageous jury from his perspective is a misrepresentation.
I'm just saying, if you're the prosecutor, you want to be in Manhattan for this case. I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather be.
Well, it happened in Manhattan. That's not some unfair mulligan. If you murder someone in Manhattan,
I'm just saying,
if you homicide someone in Manhattan.
Right, but I'm just saying this. What didn't happen in Orange County or like in the villages in Florida? This happened in like one
Okay.
of the most left-wing liberal
But
places in all
I
of.
want to get to
With
this.
Go ahead. I didn't
wanna
want
get
to
to
be
this
in the
other
position
part of
where
it
I'm
that you
like,
brought
like
up.
I said,
No,
I don't necessarily think the not guilty verdict is just. It's just based on what I know. I think the maximalist condemnation here of saying, oh, he got away with it because he's a privileged white guy and black lives
Well, I
lives
didn't
aren't
say any of those
valued.
things.
You referred to the
I
Black
didn't say
Lives
he's a privileged
Matter.
white guy. No, I didn't say a thing about his privilege. I was talking about Jordan Neely's obvious lack of privilege. I didn't say you don't have to be privileged to not be homeless, and you don't have to be privileged to be white and have more empathy cast upon you in a criminal justice system.
The context for the discussion was that powerful people get away with things in the justice system. Go ahead.
Powerful. Of course, someone who has a home and a roof over their head and a salary and no mental illness has more power in that dynamic than the homeless guy who's having a
more
mental
powerful
episode.
than a homeless person is a pretty low bar of power.
Of course it is, Glenn, but that's why this is such a kind of a galling example for some people. The one other thing I want to say about this is I recall in law school also that there was this concept from I think English common law of the fragile skull rule that says, okay, I might punch somebody in a bar fight and expect them not to die because, you know, people get in bar fights, people punch people all the time. But if they happen to have some hemophilia, let's say, for instance, and they bleed out and die, I'm still responsible for it because my initial action was still unlawful. Like my choice to punch them was intentional and unlawful, and I have to deal with the downstream consequences. And I understand that some aspect of this case, that Jordan Neely's sickle cell apparently came up during the trial as a factor in his death in a way that was exculpatory for Penney, which again, I haven't been in law school for a very, very long time, but that also gave me some pause because what are the implications of saying if I have a disease, in this case, a disease that overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, affects Black people, then and I happen to kill someone with that disease, that goes against my own accountability. Is it easier now?
I don't know. I think we need to be careful not to speculate on the cause of death that we don't really know. But or like the likelihood that something like this would result in death. But I know it did because they were trying to say that this person was not a healthy person of the sort that you would expect a normal reaction to a chokehold like this from. But
yes.
let me point out the other side of the law that I actually remembered from law school as well, and I just quickly checked, which is there's a concept of a Good Samaritan law, which encourages people to want to be involved in saving other people, even if they're not professionals and may not do it the right way. So, for example, if you see somebody lying there having a heart attack, if a doctor or a ambulance arrives and the person needs CPR and the EMS personnel administers CPR poorly or incorrectly and the person dies, then the family can go and sue the EMS personnel because they didn't do what they were trained to do. But if there's no EMS, no ambulance, no doctor, and just some ordinary person is walking by and sees someone having a heart attack or a stroke or some kind of thing and intervenes medically with the intent to try and save them, but they end up doing the wrong thing because they're not really trained, the law says you can't sue that person as long as they did their best, because we want to encourage citizens to get involved when other people need protection. We don't want to tell them if you do the slightest thing wrong when you get involved, your life is going to be ruined, because then nobody will get involved and people will just be threatened and hurt and menaced. And a lot of people who could do something about it will stand there paralyzed. And so I didn't know we were going to get so deep into this case because I probably would have said, like, I'm not necessarily the person to do this, but I do want to say that there is that component where it is a big deal to be trapped in a subway and have a obviously mentally unwell person saying very disturbing and threatening things. And the idea that, oh, everybody on the train should just either try and talk them out of it or do nothing because somebody who tried it ended up with a bad outcome. I don't know. I think that could be a pretty dangerous signal to send to society as well about our responsibilities to one another.
But why the knee-jerk rejection of the idea that, yeah, people should try to talk them out of it? And I also want to push back against the framing of, I have to push back against on the framing of trapped on the train. People move to the other end of the car, a thing that I have also done with some regularity. And usually it's a out of sight, out of mind situation. And when you get to the next stop, you can, in fact, leave the car and go to a next car down. In fact, you can go between cars while the train is still moving, if you like. That's a thing that you can do. And I think that ultimately, if Daniel Penney, if Daniel Penney
You got that right, yeah.
Genuinely being heroic, he would have maybe put his body between Jordan Neely and the people he was menacing.
That's a lot more dangerous. That's a lot more dangerous to do. You're now calling on Daniel Penney to undertake a lot more risk.
Be a hero. But this is where we're getting to. This is the core of it. Daniel Penney acted in a way that had the least risk to him and the most risk to Jordan Neely, and decided that he was going to intervene in a way that was going to preserve himself at the risk of causing grievous harm to somebody else.
Of course. That's Norman human nature. That's human nature. That's
it's
human
not
instinct.
Human nature. And that's the problem.
Not?
That's the problem with the cops. That's how you get cops. Well, there was that famous case a couple of years ago where a cop, there was somebody with a knife or something. I don't think it was a gun. And they drove the car right up to the person with the knife, got out. Now they're in proximity of the person with the knife. They say, I'm threatened because now I am in physical proximity of the person with the knife. And then they shoot them. You don't get to put yourself in a situation of danger and then be like, oh gosh, now I have to kill this other person, when you could have just walked away. And we also do have legal obligations to try to remove ourselves from struggle.
Who could have walked away? You're saying Daniel Penney could have walked away?
Yes, Daniel Penney could have walked away.
Of course, that's what most people would have done. They would have been like, screw this is my problem. I'm not going to put myself at risk in order to protect these other people. That's not, I don't think we want to encourage that.
No, that's what people did when they simply removed themselves from the situation by going to the other end of the car.
No, there were a lot of people who said they did not feel safe. A lot of women testify they felt threatened. Can I just ask you, in this case, who was the initial wrongdoer? Was it Daniel Penney or was it Neely?
Jordan Neely.
I
think, of course, Jordan Neely is wrong to threaten and menace people.
He was the initial wrongdoer. Absent his wrongdoing, none of this would have happened.
He is not the person who initiated physical contact that was a clear and grievous violation.
No, I know. I'm just asking you, who was the initial wrongdoer? Do you agree that it was Jordan Neely?
Oh, if we're going to really do this in a sort of a big picture
Why not answer?
I just did, but then you didn't seem to be happy with my answer. I just said that Jordan Neely was wrong to have menaced people. I just said that.
Absent that wrongdoing, none of this would have happened. And so the argument is not that Daniel Neely went on some hunt to kill people. It was he reacted excessively to a situation that you think was less dangerous than a lot of people
Jordan
on the train
Neely
said it was.
has been wandering around the subway system, being a menace, and at sometimes going to jail because he actually committed crimes, real crimes, unlike in this situation where he did not commit a crime, for years without killing anybody. The only person
But you don't know that when you're in that moment. You don't know that in that moment. You don't have the ability to you don't know how dangerous that person is.
But you're not allowed to kill people because you think that they might kill somebody.
That isn't what happened, though. That isn't what happened. He didn't set up to go kill him. The person ended up dying. It is true.
You don't get
that Neely. But Bree, you yourself said you would have wanted a police officer to. I think we're going in circles, but you yourself said a police officer should have restrained the person in that situation.
I did not say that, Glenn.
Okay, you should
did not say that.
Okay, let me ask you that. Let me ask you.
But Glenn, I was very clear. I was very clear about non-physical intervention, and I feel the same way about Jordan Neely. And if you are not brave enough to take that on, then you don't have to. You can leave.
Let me ask you that question. Let's say the same exact situation had happened as it happened, and a police officer intervened. And I thought I asked you this, and tried in the first instance to talk him out of it, talk him down, calm him down. And instead he got more aggressive and started threatening people even further, throwing more things, saying more threatening things. In that instance, would a police officer have had the right to physically restrain him? Or should he have just said, well, I tried to talk him out of it. Nothing I can do. Sorry, you're going to have to
that's the question. I think that's a sort of a question about what the laws are in New York. I suspect that the laws there's some law against causing public disturbance, et cetera, that would justify bringing somebody in. Maybe there's also mental holds and other kinds of things that I'm sure exist that would justify restraining Jordan Neely, of course.
And let's say if that restraint had led to Jordan Neely's death, even though the police officer had done everything the way you're supposed to, let's say Jordan Neely resisted that restraint, he hit his head on the floor, or hit his head on the wall or the metal post that you hold on to on the subway. Let's say something like that happened and he died. Would you say, oh, the cop murdered him? You don't have the right to go around murdering people?
If the police officer did everything the way he was supposed to, is a big if. If the police officer did everything they were supposed to, is a huge
And what did
if.
Daniel Neely do in this situation that he should not have done? What should he have done differently?
Well, he laid his hands on somebody who had no authority to put his hands on and was violent
But
against
you were just
him
saying the police,
first.
you would have, but morally, obviously the entire court system just decided otherwise. But you in the case of the cop, you were saying that in the event that he tried to talk him out of it and he kept being threatening, that physical intervention, physical restraint would have been justified.
Yes, because David Penney isn't trained in psychiatric holds and doesn't have like sedation tools or whatever else would be at the disposal of a mental health practitioner or a police officer who should be in a position to actually deal with someone who's in the middle of a mental health crisis. There's a huge difference.
I mean, I think that it would be best if a police officer is there, but if not, again, that's why Good Samaritan laws exist, because there's not always an EMS truck there. There's not always a police officer there trained. And we want to encourage ordinary citizens to get involved to help other people and not be petrified that if they do and they do it the wrong way, they're going to end up in prison. I don't know. I feel like we've exhausted this. I'm happy to keep talking about it, but I just...
No, that's fine. I really do want to get back to Luigi Mangione, because it's difficult for me to see now. How are you applying all of this, your kind of perspective with respect to the Jordan Neely, Daniel Penney case, in the case of Brian Thompson and Luigi Mangione? We were talking about the difference between, you're talking about the difference between sort of the law and morality. And in this instance, your priority is focusing on what you perceive to be the appropriate working of the law, regardless of if you think there is some inconsistency with the moral accounting, and that maybe you don't. I don't know, but there's.
I feel like a good part of our discussion of the Daniel Penney, Jordan Neely thing was moral at least as much as it was legal.
How so?
Well, because what I was trying to get to was whether or not Daniel Neely did something ethical or moral, that behavior that we want to encourage somebody to do. The legalities of it were worked out in the court system. I mean, the jury heard all the evidence and decided that he didn't break the law. Those people actually sat through all the testimony, unlike us. So legally, he was exonerated because they found he did not have the requisite intent for any of those charges, that he wasn't really trying to harm or kill Jordan Neely. So yes, we did talk about the law and we talked about certain aspects of the law. We agreed, for example, we didn't know exactly what the police would have had the right to do in that situation. But for me, I feel like the discussion was more moral. And at some points, I even asked you, like, ethically and morally, what should Daniel Neely have done? So I feel like that was the bulk of the conversation. And I have the same perspective when it comes to obviously, in the CEO case, what the killer did is illegal, right? There's no dispute about that. It's illegal. I just think the harder question is the moral and ethical one. The legal one's easy, right?
I'm trying to figure out what I'm struggling with. I've put into words what I'm struggling with. I feel as though the reality of our legal system is preempting the moral argument in the Neely Penney case and is being used as a example for why it in fact is moral, because it is creating certain incentives that you think are good and I frankly think are bad. I think it's bad to create an incentive where you kill homeless people because you think
that's very
they might do something.
I don't. If you're going to purport to frame it, you should frame it neutrally. Obviously, I don't think people should be encouraged to go around killing homeless people. That's not my view. I don't think it's people. That's not what I think people should be encouraged to do.
Ficklin, the way this conversation is going is that I'm experiencing, and tell me if I'm wrong, what I'm hearing from you is that there's a sort of presumption that absent exactly what Daniel Penney did, there was no better way to intervene. And I challenge that.
I don't know
am
that. I don't know
completely-
that. I don't know that at all. I mean, as what I was saying with the Good Samaritan laws, like if you give CPR to somebody and you do it imperfectly, but you're trying to save them and they end up dying because
Right.
of your mistakes,
But that is a
unless
very
you're a
different
trained
thing.
professional, you're going to end up. I think it's very similar.
I think it's a very different thing because the law, what I believe the law should be designed to incentivize are interventions that are life preserving ultimately. And that the same way that we have laws about proportionality in terms of the response of the police and others in these sorts of situations, that proportionality should have dictated that at very least, absent Jordan Neely physically striking somebody else, Daniel Penney had no right to physically restrain him in a way that ultimately resulted in his death. That being said, on the other side, you're right. The law is very clear about whether or not you're allowed to gun down people in private, especially in a premeditated way, especially, frankly, in terms of how the crimes get actually resolved and criminals actually get pursued and locked up disproportionately when you murder somebody who's affluent. But I think frustration is that to the extent that I feel like the law is leading the morals in the Penney situation, it's also leading the morals for a lot of people in the CEO situation. But there is enough understanding about the immorality of what Brian Thompson's professional life was to cause there to be an enormous amount of sympathy for Luigi, despite the law being infinitely more clear in that scenario. And that's really interesting to me because it does say a lot about how many people have been so grievously harmed by the private health insurance industry. But I think it also does say something about, as much as people can relate to that, how little they can relate to the experience of Jordan Neely.
I don't know what internet feed you're on, but for me and mine, both of these have been extremely controversial. I mean, I guess if you primarily are listening to the left, you would definitely conclude that most people are, if not supportive of, at least understanding of what Luigi did in shooting this CEO. But if you're listening to even mainstream media, let alone right-wing media, people are outraged that at anyone who's saying anything other than send that guy to jail for the rest of his life, he's evil. It's extremely polarizing. It's not that there's this widespread support for him. In fact, quite the contrary, huge numbers of people, and it's coming from so many different places, are disgusted at any of those sentiments that say, oh, we understand why he would have gone and murdered him. Similar to that, you've heard that. You've heard that, haven't you?
No, I mean, I've heard it from Lori Ingram. I saw Ben Shapiro.
And Josh Shapiro in his
I heard Josh Shapiro.
Every Democratic member of Congress practically, and there's a lot of them, every member of Congress practically in both parties that I've heard speak out against it on this issue.
Yes.
Have essentially said it's incredibly disgusting to cheer a murder. I feel like that's the very prevailing mainstream view in
But Glenn, I think it's the prevailing mainstream view of elite political actors and pundits. I completely agree. Yeah, I've seen that sentiment from people who have $1 million plus, billion plus, almost $1 trillion in the bank. But I've seen it not at all from even the folks who follow those folks and support those folks ideologically. So I think on the Ben Shapiro video, he got 25,000 downvotes. And all of the comments are, this isn't about leftists. This isn't about, ideology. We all hate the insurance companies and you're an elitist.
Right, for sure. I agree with that. No, I totally agree with that. In fact, we looked at the first day when United Health posted the death notice and this condolences and, lamenting the loss of their great leader, whatever. I think there was, at the time we looked at it, something, I think it was Ken Klippenstein who actually showed it to me, that at the time when we looked, there was something like 9,000 responses. It was on Facebook, on the Facebook page, the official Facebook page of United Health. And, Facebook shows the number of emojis of each person choosing a particular emoji, and the vast majority of the vast majority of people responding chose the laughing emoji. And so I agree with you completely. There's definitely widespread, on the internet especially, widespread rage at this industry that ended up finding a vehicle for expression in how people responded to this murder. But if you were to say to me, I think if we did a poll in the next 3 days, do you support the actions of Luigi or whoever is the person who killed do you support the execution or the assassination of the CEO of United Healthcare? I have my serious doubts about whether a majority of people would say, yes, I support that. But you're right. There's no question. There's a huge outpouring across the spectrum of hatred for this industry.
Right. And I think that almost confuses the issue a little bit. I think, yes, most people don't believe in murder. I don't even support the death penalty. So I can't sit here and say, I think this should have happened. But that's a very different thing. And this goes back to the Bill Barr clip that we started with. It's a very different Bill Burr, sorry. LOL. Bill Burr clip that we started with. That there is an intentional there's an intentional effort to conflate empathy for Luigi's motive for the act of vigilante murder, which again, it's interesting given how much we were talking about that kind of the relevance of motive versus the outcomes in the other case. But to stay with this for a second, like, it does feel like a shift. Like for as much as Bill Burr was saying, you're hearing mainstream media figures wanting to focus on these on the life lost and the family of the guy. I saw a Fox News story about how Luigi lived in Hawaii in a shared penthouse, the implication being that he was affluent and so therefore we shouldn't care about him. Focus on the fact that he went to a very Tony prep school in Baltimore, that his family is of some means, all of these things. And people are debating his ideological priors, each side hoping that he is a devotee of the other side's politics, because ostensibly it seems to me, then that side doesn't have to care. Liberals don't have to care if he turns out about the underlying healthcare issue, if he turns out to be conservative, and vice versa. And that seems to all be very much missing the point. But as much as I think I agree with Bill Burr that there is this resistance to talking about the underlying issue, I have been kind of heartened by some of the conversations that have been happening on the mainstream. There was an interview with Wendell Pierce, who I believe is a former healthcare executive, who sort of flipped and started talking about all the dirt that he knows from the inside on, I think, MSNBC.
It's notable that this murder, this corporate assassination, took place in Manhattan on the day that United Health was holding its investor day. This assailant had to know that was significant, because the reason why we have these delays, why we have this challenge that so many people with health insurance have in getting the care that they need, is because of the slavish devotion of these companies to Wall Street. They have to meet Wall Street's profit expectations every 3 months, and to show them that they are managing expenses. And that means there's greater and greater use of prior authorization, higher out-of-pocket costs before their coverage kicks in, inadequate provider networks. Delays and denials are what people encounter these days increasingly if they have health insurance. And I think it's been just below the surface. I knew when I was in the industry, people despise these companies. They hate dealing with them because they're difficult to deal with. And often they get a no. And it's so hard to figure out what to do when you get that no.
I saw a clip with Joyanne Reed talking to Tom Hartman, where Tom Hartman is giving a breakdown of historically why it is that we don't have single payer health care. And the various lobby groups and interest groups that have fought against it, and also the way that racism specifically was lobbied to make the case that you basically can make all Black people die out if you just don't provide health care, and then it could kick out at a later date.
With health care, the history of the American healthcare system is absolutely shocking. We are the only country in the developed world that doesn't recognize healthcare as a right, as a human right, and doesn't cover every single person in the country. 25 million people in America have no health insurance whatsoever, and roughly half of us are radically underinsured. And that just is something that no other country would tolerate. And it goes back to a fellow named Frederick Hoffman. In 1887, Germany got the world's first single-payer healthcare system. Hoffman came over to the United States and got a gig as vice president of the Prudential Insurance Company. And in 1896, he published a book called Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro. And his argument was that black people were genetically inferior, and therefore, if we simply denied them health care, eventually, within a few generations, all black people would die out, and this would solve the race problem in America. His book was one of the best-selling books in America from 1896 to around 1930. He testified before Congress dozens of times. He testified before all kinds of states. Prudential put him on a nationwide tour. He was the reason why Harry Truman's effort at single-payer health care was shot down. He was the reason why FDR's effort at single-payer health care was shot down. And he was long dead in 1965 when Medicare came along, but his teachings were actually cited as one of the reasons why there's a 20% hole in Medicare, so that poor people, read that in the South as poor black people, would show up at the hospital and wouldn't thus integrate the doctor's office. I mean, that's how we got a privatized healthcare system rather than essentially a socialized healthcare system like everybody else has, where the government makes sure that everybody is covered. It's just an insane story. I wrote a book about the hidden history of American healthcare, and I was just astonished when I learned this backstory.
You know, that is amazing. This is why we booked Tom Hartman, because that is an important history.
There have been a variety of discussions that I never would have anticipated breaking through at all. And I guess my question to you is, do you have any optimism about Democrats or even Republicans capitalizing on this moment to actually push through any kind of healthcare reform? Or do you think this little like lacuna that's opened up in our willingness to talk about this in the mainstream media is just the kind of carrots they throw to the left when they're out of power, and it's going to close back up shortly?
But yeah, unfortunately, I think it's the latter. But at the same time, I think every time there's an emergence of a discussion of this kind, it isn't really just, oh, we hate the healthcare industry, the health insurance industry. It's that we hate these big corporations in general. Now, maybe the health insurance industry is even crueler and more sadistic, because I said from my own personal experience, when you're dealing with with the sickness of a loved one or your own or some catastrophic event, the last thing you want to have to do is talk about whether you're going to have to pay for it and how. And maybe it's slightly more enraging. But one of the things I think is really interesting is that if you look at a lot of Republican discourse from sort of the newer type Republicans, the kind of more populist ones, people like Josh Hawley or J.D. Vance, who are huge fans, for example, of Lena Khan, who thinks she's doing a fantastic job standing up to corporate greed and corporate centralization of corporate power. You have these hearings a lot. I just actually watched one by chance a couple of days ago, where the CEOs of airlines were called before the Senate. And, a bunch of them from both parties, Josh Hawley, but others as well, sat there for 10 minutes just bashing the crap out of these CEOs, saying, flying on your airlines is a miserable experience. You treat people like cattle. You impose all these hidden charges. There's nothing they can do. They get forced to give up their bags or take their bags, depending on what's better for you.
Oh, how much have you paid people to pull out customers who are in line with a bag that's 2 centimeters too big, Mr. Schroeder?
Well, we recognize this is a hard job, and so therefore we incentivize them to do that.
How much?
It's $10 per bag.
Wow, $10 per bag. And I think, Mr. Klein, you and Mr. Schroeder, your airlines cumulatively have spent $26 million paying gate agents between 2022 and 2023 to catch passengers whose bags are a little bit too big. $26 million. I mean, if people want to know why it's such a terrible experience to fly, this is news for them today. Your airlines are paying millions of dollars to your employees to harass people who've already paid. They're there in line because they've already paid. It's unbelievable. By the way, let me just ask you this while I have you here. Why is it that you charge different people different fees for carry-on bags? Why is that, Mr. Klein? Why isn't it just a flat fee? Why is it that I might get charged one fee, but my wife might get charged a different fee? Why is that?
So overall, our job is to generate the most revenue we can, so we can be profitable as an airline. If we're not profitable, actually we have costs, and there's costs out there, and we have to make sure that we're above the cost line in order to make sure that we can run a profitable entity.
Yeah, I got it. No, I got it. I got it. And money's the answer. So you're last year, your carry-on bag fees range between $15 and $99. That's extraordinary. One person might pay 15, somebody else might pay 99. How do you determine it? Is it based on personal characteristics?
It's
you charge
never
women more?
It's never based on personal characteristics.
You charge minors more?
We do not, sir.
What, just people who are suckers? I mean, how do you do it?
Well, there is a cost to carry any kind of bag.
Yeah, but why do you charge some people more?
I think that the smarter politicians understand, and I do think Trump has channeled some of this rhetorically, that one of the things that makes lives miserable for Americans is having to deal with these huge, faceless, amoral corporations that see you as a cog or a piece of property to squeeze and exploit for every last cent of profit. And I think a lot of the frustration that Americans have, a lot of the sense of powerlessness and alienation comes from constantly having your life determined by these processes that you can't see or control. And it is probably the worst in a case where you're desperate to get medical attention for a loved one or yourself, and you have to convince some person on the phone to approve you're being able to go to see a doctor or to approve paying for it afterward if it's too expensive. But I think it's this proxy for this broader anger at corporatism. Now, whether both parties are able to come together in Washington and Trump is willing to sign a law or whatever, those things are, very down the road. But I actually do think it's been very beneficial, regardless of what you think of the morality of the assassination itself or the killing itself, to force people who don't normally want to talk about it to have to ask the question, why is there this outpouring of rage? I mean, there was a New York Times article 3 days after it happened. And, you could see it before the New York Times saw it, but they finally can write about it, saying outpouring of, glee or joy or rage at this industry. Why is this happening? And forcing people to ask that question, I think, has been a huge benefit, a huge value.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up those kinds of hearings because, sorry, not to be this person, but I do think that part of the conceit of the force the vote moment was supposed to be to force that kind of a public conversation at a time when 15 million people had just been kicked off of their healthcare because of the nature of us having an employer-based healthcare system in the middle of a pandemic, when a bunch of people were made redundant. they became unemployed because businesses shut down and we're forced to shut down, right? The government tells your job to fire you, and now you don't have health insurance in the middle of a public health crisis. That was the moment in the eyes of many folks to be forcing this issue in the exact same way that this conversation has forced it. And I am concerned. I should put it this way. I am excited about the possibility of activists, politicians, whomever, being able to really stick the landing on this and force something more than just a conversation. But I also am deeply skeptical of the likelihood of that actually happening.
Yeah, I mean, as you know it better than I. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. But just quickly, I do think the sentiment is real. Remember when they wanted to pass that COVID relief bill to give huge amounts of money to large businesses and the like? It was Bernie Sanders who stood there and filibustered the bill, demanding that it not be passed unless it have direct payments to ordinary Americans. And the person who stood there with him filibustering it was Josh Hawley. And they ended up succeeding in getting that law stopped and a $600 payment put into it. And then it went to Trump, who vetoed it, saying he thought it should be higher and $2,000. So we have seen some, whether it's cynical or just a recognition of political realities, these sentiments are merging more so than they ever did before. But at the end of the day, the establishment wings of both parties still remain dominant. And they answer to a donor class that wants everything other than these kinds of discussions, and especially these kinds of solutions. And that's why I remain, despite these encouraging changes, I guess, to the political landscape, pretty pessimistic about whether Washington will ultimately deliver a solution, absent, to be honest, more attacks of the kind that just happened on the CEO of United Healthcare. And that gets back to what Bill Burr was saying and what we were talking about at the beginning, which is that it is important sometimes that the elite have some healthy fear that if they go too far, if they get too greedy, if they get too avaricious, if they get too indifferent to the welfare of most people, there will be consequences to that.
Did you happen to catch Luigi Mangione's Goodreads review of the Unabomber's book? Of John Kaczynski's
I happen to
book?
catch pretty much everything that has been said or published about Luigi, including that. So yes, I'm extremely, you can ask me anything about his life and I am one of the preeminent experts. But
What's his sign, Glenn? Do we know?
that I don't know. I haven't figured out his astrology yet, but I'm sure I'm going to get to that. I'll hear from somebody.
No, I think someone tweeted that he was a Taurus, so of course he got caught in the McDonald's.
All right, there you go. Yeah, exactly. I have no doubt that some gay friend of mine will be very shortly texting me his entire astrological code. But, I think that the Unabomber thing is so interesting because when the Unabomber was doing his murders, and one of the things that Luigi had a problem with morally, he said about what the Unabomber did was that he didn't target his killings. He actually just killed people arbitrarily. There was a lot of collateral damage. People who had done nothing wrong were killed. And I thought that moral critique by Luigi of his manifesto was actually interesting. But one of the things he obviously wanted in doing what he did more than anything was to force a conversation about the oppressive nature of technology, about modernization in a very prescient way. And he basically negotiated with the New York Times and the Washington Post in order to get his manifesto into those newspapers. And, I think most people who are being honest, who have read it, will say that it was an incredibly prescient and important contribution to our discourse about where modern society is going and the ways that it's degrading humanity in ways that might be intended or not, and the dangers from that. And that is what Luigi said in response to the manifesto. And as you can see, I really am an expert in Luigi's writings and his views, which is that he said, obviously, people look at the Unabomber or somebody like that, meaning including him now, and say, oh, this guy was a psychopath. He was, evil. He murdered people. But in reality, he argued that sometimes causes do require resort to violence because it's the only way to be heard. And I think the Unabomber is a good illustration of that. And I think Luigi, if that's who ends up being the murderer, will be a good illustration of that as well.
Yeah, it's very like civil disobedience. He says, yes, he maimed innocent people and he's rightfully imprisoned, which suggests that Luigi understands that he was going to be caught. That's why he had a manifesto, assuming it's him, and that he is willing to be legally accountable for what he did. But then he quotes the Unabomber as saying, or this take as saying, I had the balls to recognize that peaceful protest has gotten us absolutely nowhere. And at the end of the day, he's probably right. Oil barons haven't listened to any environmentalists, but they feared him. When all other forms of communication fail, violence is necessary to survive. You may not like his methods, but to see things from his perspective, it's not terrorism, it's war and revolution. And goes on and on in that way. And I think you're right about the conversation that's been sparked and how, if anything, this has been actually shockingly well tailored to have a more high level conversation about healthcare than, frankly, it seems even Bernie Sanders managed to push through 2 political campaigns. Joy-Ann Reid certainly wasn't entertaining conversations about Medicare for all when Bernie Sanders was the face of it. Luigi's face, for whatever reason, seems to be a lot more appealing in that regard. I've had you here an hour and a half, Glenn, so I just want to quickly ask you just 2 quick things before I let you go. One is, I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to some criticism from Whitney Webb when she was on the show recently. I want guests to always have an opportunity to offer some pushback, and I felt in the moment that I wasn't as familiar with what we were talking about to offer that. So I just want to, we've queued up a piece of that conversation to give you an opportunity to respond and correct anything that might have been an inaccuracy. Can we listen to that, Armand?
As far as Glenn Greenwald goes, I can't quite remember exactly why he left The Intercept, but I do know that by the time the Snowden archive was shuttered, the big critics of it were Laura Poitras and some other people, and Glenn Greenwald defended the argument that it was shuttered due to cost. He and I had some back and forth a few years ago, because when he was still at The Intercept, because I was reporting relatively critically on it, some of the things I mentioned earlier, also Pierre Omidyar's ties to the national security state, and also the fact that 3 of the people that provided leaks to them that were not Snowden after Snowden, like Reality Winner, for example, were essentially burned by the journalists that had taken their information and, sentenced to prison. Daniel Hale being another one. And the question is, how did that happen? How did it happen 3 times, especially when the organization framed itself as being safe for leakers or whistleblowers because of the Snowden case, right?
Yeah.
So, I find that concerning. And Glenn Greenwald was very dismissive of my concerns at the time. Maybe he will not be now because he, has seemingly changed opinion about, The Intercept as an organization and things of that nature. But again, we don't really talk, so I don't really know.
If you don't, if you don't want to,
no, I'm happy. I'm happy to respond. I heard that after you and I spoke, and you mentioned that she had said things about that. I actually went and listened to it. So, I'm happy to respond to that. First of all, I think I had mentioned this to you, that Whitney Webb is a person who sometimes says things that are informed and kind of sober and analytical, and other times she's just completely off the wall and says stuff that is totally false and crazy and conspiratorial. And I know that because I've been the target of that before. During the early stages of the Intercept, Pierre Omidyar had said that he was going to invest a total of $250 million, not in the Intercept, but in the broad media company that he wanted to build, which ended up being the Intercept, and media properties, and a documentary, and a film company. And she was one of those people who went around saying Pierre Omidyar had paid us $250 million. And I think she alluded to it here as well, basically to buy the archive, to control the archive. And the reality is, all we ever got from the Intercept was the salary that was public. It was $400,000 a year. It was never anything close to $250 million. He didn't invest that amount of money in the Intercept. But more so, much more important part was Pierre Omidyar never touched the archive. He never looked at it. The only copies of the full Snowden archive that ever existed were in the exclusive control and hands of myself and Laura Poitras. And we had the right to publish whatever we wanted from it. I still have the archive in my hands, and so does she. Pierre Omidyar never got that copy. He never controlled it. He never once tried to intervene and say, no, you can't publish that story, or you can only publish this story. And obviously, the minute anybody tried to censor me, she says she doesn't know why I left the Intercept, by telling me that I couldn't write a story that was right before the 2020 election, when I wanted to write about the Hunter Biden laptop and the materials from it. The minute somebody told me you can't publish what you think you want to write about, I quit, which is obviously what I would have done, especially had anyone tried to do that with the Snowden story. So this whole conspiracy theory that Pierre Omidyar, with national security ties, bought the archive. He never had any knowledge of what was in the archive. He never touched it. He never looked at it. He had no control over what we would publish. The idea that Laura or myself would ever be told by Pierre Omidyar, you can't publish something in the Snowden archive, we'd be like, oh, okay, was preposterous. But that's the sort of thing that she was saying. About the specific issue of closing the archive was closed to cost. So let me just quickly tell you the set of facts. We began reporting on the Snowden story in 2013. I went to meet Hong Kong with meet Snowden with Laura Poitras in Hong Kong at the end of May of 2013, and we began doing the reporting a week later on June 6, 2013. The archive was not closed until 6 full years later in 2019. Other media outlets, much, much bigger and richer than The Intercept, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Der Spiegel, got parts of the archive. They never got the entire archive, but they got parts of it. They closed their archive and stopped reporting in 2014 or 2015, way before we did, years before we did, because it's so expensive to maintain this archive. And I'll tell you exactly why. In order to keep this archive in a way that you're fulfilling your promise to your source, which is not to make sure that it doesn't all leak, which will destroy his credibility, that it doesn't get into the hands of somebody else who might use it for other purposes, you have to build what essentially is a SCIF, the kind of room that the federal government uses for classified documents, with all the controls and all the security that go along with it, with all the safeguards, with the protection, with the technology experts. It costs millions of dollars a year. And New York Times, the Washington Post, the Der Spiegel, the Guardian, once they squeezed that archive for about a year and felt like there were no more real stories there, they said, we don't want to pay for this anymore. The Intercept, even though we were getting to the point where Pierre was withdrawing his money, we were getting to the point where we were laying off people, we continued to pay that money all the way until 2019. And we kept doing the reporting. The problem is, after 6 years, there wasn't much left in the archive to report. There was really no meat on the bones any longer. And people like Whitney Webb, who complain like, oh, they should have kept reporting it. I can tell you that every time from like 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2-3 years after the reporting began, every time we published a story from the Snowden archive, nobody read it. It got no traffic, no discussion. Nobody like Whitney Webb talked about it. All she likes to do is posture like, why did you only do 6 years of this reporting? The reason is because there was basically nothing left in the report, in the archive to do. Hundreds of reporters from around the world had been through that archive. I did reporting in 18 different countries with 18 different media outlets. I let all of them go through it about their countries. So if she wants to claim that there's something else left in the archive that every journalist who has gone through it all conspired to conceal, I guess she can say that. But I didn't want to close the archive. I felt like the archive should remain open forever. But I also understood the Intercept's argument, which is that whatever we can do with this archive and the amount of money we're spending is preventing us from doing other journalism that would have a much bigger impact. Nobody was reading the Snowden stories in 2018 and 2019. No one cared. It was like they were not very significant stories. And so, of course, as an institution, as a journalistic outlet, you have to decide, is the millions of dollars a year better spent on keeping the Snowden archive limping along with basically nothing left? Or is it better on hiring more reporters, making sure they have lawyers and, can travel and people like that? The Intercept made that decision. And although it wasn't my decision, I ended up supporting it because I understood their reasons. And to this very day, both Laura and I have the archive and we have access to it. If there's things in there, we often consult with people or let people have access. So it's not like the archive has just disappeared. There's just nothing left after 6 years to squeeze out of it. Final thing is about these sources. Like, she's very conspiratorial as well. You notice when she says like, oh, why did their sources get caught? Not just one, but like Daniel Hale and Reality Whitner. I have a lot of questions about that as well. I'm sure she's implied, I'm pretty sure, but I know people like her have that, oh, what happened with the Intercept? It was like a honey trap. Like, we purposely induce sources to leak to us. And then because Pierre Midyar has ties to the national security state, he purposely turned those sources over. I personally never had any of my sources at the Intercept in any story I worked on arrested. So I didn't have anything to do with the Reality Winner story or Daniel Hale. Talking about some of the best, most trustworthy journalists in the country, like Jeremy Scahill and Ryan Grimm. And I don't know if Whitney Webb knows this or not, but when you do very sensitive journalism involving highly sensitive leaks from the national security state, they have ways of detecting that. And if you're the Washington Post and the New York Times, and you're getting official leaks from the CIA or the FBI or the Pentagon, you're doing what they want you to do. Nobody tries to find your sources. But if you're doing the kind of journalism that we were doing, which is getting documents that they didn't want people to see, they do everything possible to find your sources. And the idea that because Jeremy had a source that they found, or because the people who work in the Reality Winner source had a source that was found, the government, especially in a ubiquitous security state, is going to find your sources no matter how careful you are. They weren't careful in the Reality Winner case. They were in the other cases. And to spread this innuendo like, oh, it was because Pierre and we were purposely trying to attract sources to turn them over to the government, it was completely disgusting, especially given that we're all journalists who, unlike her, have actually taken risks to bring these stories to the public, have confronted the U.S. security state. So anyway, that's the response to that critique.
Okay. Well, a little bit of ad hominem aside, I appreciate you offering some clarification there. I did want to just ask you, just so I understand. So her argument, as I understood it in part, was why not make the archive open? Is that the national security? Like, what's the rationale for not just saying this should be open source? Because I remember when you and I were talking a little bit about the Twitter files and some of the potential for sort of curating a perception of what was going on through the release. If Elon Musk obviously has an incentive to release everything that makes the previous ownership look bad, that aligns with his own political ideology, and even if that's stuff that's worth reporting on and interesting to note, that one has to be careful about how it's framed to the broader public. At least this was my argument. That we have to be careful about how it's framed to the broader public when you're only getting a small fraction of who knows what exists. So, what do you think about the balance of interest there and kind of who's allowed access to the archive and why not make it public? Or at least more
by make it public, do you mean like just dump it all on the internet?
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Like dump it all on the internet without any redactions, anything?
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, the reason why I would never, ever, ever dump the Snowden archive on the internet is in part because it would violate my commitment that we made to him when we got this archive, which is he understood there's a lot of material in there that should never see the light of day. Because, for example, there's a lot of documents in there that accuse certain people of having ties to terrorist organizations. They've never been brought to trial. So what, you're going to just dump a bunch of documents with the NSA saying, oh, we surveil this person because we think he's a terrorist, and just ruin their reputation forever, have these documents on the internet forever with their name attached to unproven, unverified accusations that they have terrorist ties or that they were surveilled for baseless reasons. We did reporting on some of the people who were surveilled, but we went to all of them and said, do you want us to name you? And most of them said no, because they didn't want it known to anybody that they were suspected by the U.S. security state of having terrorist ties. So that's one reason. Another reason is it has the list of informants. It has the list of all kinds of people whose the consequences of which publishing we would never be able to anticipate. This is not the JFK file from 65 years ago. This is from 6 years ago, or actually now 8 years ago. There's still a lot of people who have a lot of active interest in these files. And because that's not what a journalist does, you don't just dump the entire file on the internet. If Snowden wanted that, he could have just uploaded it to the internet himself. And you cause immense harm when you do that. You don't inform people. There's personnel files in there about people's family problems and personal problems and medical problems when trying to tell their supervisors why they need time off. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things in there that would be so unethical to just, publish. What we did to assuage those concerns was we invited journalists from all over the world who had full unfettered access. I mean, people would come to my house in Brazil and would sit there for a week, journalists from other countries, or I would go there when I could finally travel, and they would just spend days going through the archive. And so we wanted to assure the public that it was impossible to hide newsworthy stories because of how many other journalists from around the world have gone and looked through these archives, as well as other newspapers in the United States as well. But at the same time, we would never do something as scummy or as violative of our pledge to Edward Snowden, or as destructive to so many innocent people as just taking the file and dumping it on the internet, like with no redactions or discrimination.
So 2 questions. One, you alluded to the kind of Kennedy archive being obviously older. It still has not all been released, obviously, but there is a stronger argument for doing so because it's so long ago and so many of the people involved are obviously dead. Do you think that there is a time at which in the future the Snowden archive should all be made public? And then secondarily, are there still opportunities for journalists who do want to go through the archive to do so? Is it being maintained somewhere in a way that is still accessible to journalists if they make the right appeal?
No, I mean, I have looked for institutions, and so did Laura, for people who, institutions that could maintain the Snowden archive. The problem is that, number one, as I said, it's extremely expensive. So you need institutions that are going to say, we're going to spend $800,000 a year or $2 million a year, whatever it is, to maintain this archive in a manner that's secure so that all the things that I just talked about happening don't end up happening. All the things that Snowden was concerned about happening don't end up happening. You need an institution that you can trust to maintain it. And at the same time, you need one willing to do so. We've approached a lot of institutions. In fact, we hired a woman who used to work at NPR and the New York Times to work with us in finding an institution that would be suitable to this. And we haven't so far. So do I keep a skiff in my house or like in an office where anytime a journalist calls and says, hey, I'd like to look at the Snowden files? No, I mean, if somebody wants to, pay for that, we could set that up. But
what is a skiff? I'm sorry. What is that? I mean, I feel like Kamala talking about the cloud. I don't understand.
Yeah, no, a skiff is like when the CIA or the FBI or the NSA or the Pentagon has their most sensitive and secret documents. You can't just walk around with them in briefcases or sending them by Gmail. You have to maintain them in a room that is extremely secure on servers that can't be penetrated, on things that don't connect to the internet. It requires technology specialists. It requires actually a lot of air conditioning to keep the temperature of these machines functioning. Basically, we had to recreate what the CIA or the FBI or the Pentagon uses to maintain files that huge numbers of people around the world would want to get their hands on in a secure way, but a way that was also usable. It's very expensive. That's why I said the New York Times, the Guardian, every other one.
What does that mean about where it is now? I mean, how does it didn't get just all deleted, right? So it exists somewhere in that form.
Right.
Now.
It exists in physical form, in
I see.
In thumb drives and other types of things that I don't want to get into and specify, but it also exists, elsewhere. But if you were going to give somebody the opportunity, as we paid a huge amount of money for people to do. No one else did that. The New York Times, you think they created a skiff and invited other journalists in to go look at their materials, or the Guardian? No one did that except for us. And we did it specifically to address these concerns. So, anyway, I mean, that's all I have to say. I don't want to be overly defensive about it. I mean, we reported on this for 6 years, spent a huge amount of money to do so. Nobody cared anymore about the stories we were doing. Whitney Webb didn't give the slightest crap about any of the stories we were publishing.
I'm just saying
it is fair. No, I'm telling you.
How do you know that she didn't care about?
She writes about everything. She never wrote about one of the stories. She didn't write about one of the stories like, hey, look what they just published. This is really important and interesting. Like in 2019, here's a Snowden story. We published stories up until the time that we closed them. That's why we closed them, because there were no stories anymore and no interest in those stories any longer, because there was barely any meat left on the bones. There was nothing else to report that belonged in the public interest.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate that clarity. I know that you might not have the time or interest, but I would love to see you two in conversation, just humbly, personally.
I feel like I've just been in conversation with her, so I don't really have anything else to say about these accusations other than that.
Fair enough. And I do value, obviously, when he's reporting as well. So hopefully she'll hears this and simply just either corrects her understanding of it or comes back with some different questions. And this can be all very constructive. The last thing I want to just ask you quickly about, since we haven't touched on it at all on this podcast so far, is the latest developments in Syria. I just co-hosted Useful Idiots Monday morning show with Aaron Mate when Katie was out on Monday. And I encourage people to go and listen to that, because Aaron is much more knowledgeable than I am and is an incredible resource on this issue. But I did want to give you a chance to weigh in on what you sort of think this kind of next stage in the escalation in the region means for us here domestically, especially I think in light of you're a lot more savvy and in tune with the sort of anti-war right, and whether or not you have any sort of optimism, what your generalized feelings are about how the Trump administration is going to differently affect what's been going on.
Well, the United States and Israel and Turkey got what they've wanted for the longest time. Obama unleashed a dirty war led by the CIA that cost $1 billion a year in 2011 with the goal of unseating Bashar al-Assad, and our allies in that effort, the people along whose side we fought, were al-Qaeda and ISIS. We had heard for 10 years since 9/11 that al-Qaeda and ISIS were the greatest existential threats we had ever faced. We have to fundamentally restructure our foreign policy and our civil liberties to vanquish them. And then suddenly we find ourselves fighting on their side, and we're delivering huge amounts of weapons into Syria that are ending up in the hands of al-Qaeda and ISIS. And ultimately, the Russians intervened. The only thing that would stop Bashar al-Assad from falling and these very extremist elements from taking over Syria. And the reason they did so, said John Kerry in a secret recording that we now heard, was because, and it's amazing to listen to the way he said it, he said Russia was concerned that ISIS would end up in control of Damascus, meaning we, the United States, weren't concerned about that. We agree it would have happened, but we, the United States, felt like we could live with that, whereas the Russians weren't comfortable with that. And basically, what you now have is the leader of what are now being called the rebels. They're no longer the terrorists or anything else like that. They're the rebels or the revolutionaries who, right until this very moment, the U.S. government offers $10 million Mohammed al-Jawlani on his website to find his whereabouts. The group he leads is still classified as a terrorist organization in every single European state in the United States. And now that's essentially, those elements are going to be who takes over Syria. But I think the idea is to turn it into Libya, to make Libya, they removed Muammar Gaddafi. They told us the Libyans were celebrating, and Libya is now a completely broken state. And that's essentially what's going to happen in Syria. Now, Assad was a terrible person. Syrians hated him. A lot of them are understandably happy that he's gone. But from a geostrategic perspective, from a geopolitical perspective, it's a huge win for Israel and the United States. It's a huge loss for Russia and Iran that used, and Hezbollah that used Syria to transport missiles from Iran to Hezbollah to allow Hezbollah to fight a resistance against the Israelis. And I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen when you just create a power vacuum like this. When we did it in Iraq, when we removed Saddam Hussein in Iraq and crushed the government, didn't want any of the Baathists to come into the government, we created a similar power vacuum. Even Tony Blair says that's what gave rise to ISIS and al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. And a lot of those guys are the exact ones who are now leading this fight as well and who are now in power in Syria in some form or another. So I don't think it's going to turn out well for anyone, certainly not for the Syrians.
Yeah, I said this to Aaron. I was sort of surprised how open Biden and others have been in characterizing this as a proxy battle with Russia and kind of gleefully recounting how, because Russia has had its attentions divided with Ukraine, it's why this overthrow of Assad has been able to be successful. It does feel like a moment of potential opportunity for, again, this sort of bipartisan anti-war faction to be putting pressure on the Trump administration for various kinds of more anti-interventionist policy, but it just doesn't seem like there's any connection between what is a genuine, I think, frustration with the asymmetry between domestic spending and military adventurism at this moment when so many people are facing the price crunch here at home, and any pressures being put on a new administration that positioned itself as more in tune with the kind of populist economic interests of the folks that voted for them.
Right. I mean, Trump did say in a statement, my insistence is that we just stay out. These are not our friends.
Yeah.
This is not our fight. But, and we did have 900 troops stationed in Syria, for those who don't know. And Trump actually ordered those removed in 2018, late 2017, early 2018. And the generals that were working for him conspired to sabotage that. They basically moved them around and then justified why they had to stay. And they were celebrated for that by the forces of pro-democracy freedom in the United States. The idea that generals are supposed to overrule the elected civilian who runs the military is a pretty threatening to democracy idea. But they were applauded for that. But Trump saying stay out of Syria, I'm sure he will. But the reality is the United States already got what it wanted in Syria, which was the removal of Bashar al-Assad and the empowerment of the rebels who we've been arming and funding for a long time.
Glenn, I really appreciate your patience. You've been here for 2 hours. I'm going to let you go. I did not intend this, and I promise I won't put you in the position when I ask.
It's no worries at all. No worries at all. It's always great to talk to you, Bree.
And I certainly didn't mean for us to get in a Jordan Neely, Daniel Penney cul-de-sac for about an hour, but I do think it was useful and fruitful, and I always enjoy sparring with you because you are the biggest brain, as far as I'm concerned, in our political environment right now, and I have so much respect and admiration for you, and I'm really, really grateful that you came and spent this time with us here today.
I feel the same way. We did bicker, we did fight, but it was still enjoyable, so it's always great to see you, Bree.
All right. Do you want to tell the audience anything about where they can find you?
They can find me. My show is on System Update on Rumble every night live at 7 p.m. Eastern and social media as well.
All right. Terrific. Thank you, Glenn.
All right. Great to talk to you.
Take care of yourselves. Bye, Glenn. And to all of you listening, keep the faith. If you want an extra episode of Bad Faith Podcast, you can find it on Mondays at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. I always forget to do that. And also, I know I have been derelict in my publishing over on The Debrief. These Raiders that are started up again, I got derailed a little bit by the holiday, etc. But I'm going to get back to it this week. So you can find those over on Substack at The Debrief. And again, take care of yourselves. See you next week. Keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.